They told me I was selfish, but it was my daughter's voice that cut the deepest, clear and deliberate like the snap of a bone, when she said, "I'll never take care of you. I'm not your nurse. I'm not your keeper. Don't expect me to give up my life for yours." I remember that sentence the way some people remember the exact time lightning struck near their house, or the look on a stranger's face the moment before a car accident. It was ordinary on the surface. Just a daughter speaking to her mother in the kitchen on a weekday afternoon. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. But it carried the density of years, of expectations I hadn't known I still carried, of trust that I hadn't realized could be broken so simply. I'm 78 now, and I live alone in a house that feels too big for one person, but too small to contain the echo of that sentence. The rooms remember things I would rather forget. But they also remind me that my life is mine, even now, and that no one, not even the child I carried and nursed, can take away my right to decide how I will leave this world, or to whom I will entrust what I leave behind. When people imagine old age, they picture soft blankets, photographs lined up neatly on shelves, the smell of soup on the stove, grandchildren running through the hallway, perhaps even the quiet satisfaction of knowing that after decades of sacrifice, one has earned a place in the circle of care. They rarely picture what it means to be dismissed, to be told that your body, which once bent over cribs and washing lines, which once walked miles to work and back again, will be regarded as a burden, a problem to be outsourced, a nuisance. I had not prepared myself for that, because despite the evidence of the world, despite all the stories whispered in church pews and told in low voices at the senior center about children who disappeared or children who stayed away, I believed my daughter would be different. I believed that the bond between us, the bond I had polished and protected through arguments and teenage rebellions and the long silence after her father's death, was still intact, strong enough to carry me when my knees gave out and my memory faltered. I see now how naive that was. But at the time, it was the belief that kept me standing upright. The day she said it, I was wearing my blue cardigan, the one with the frayed sleeve I never throw out because it still smells faintly of the garden from the house we used to live in. She had come over not to see me, but to check on the plumbing, or so she said, though it quickly became clear she had another agenda. She looked around the kitchen as if appraising it, the way one does with real estate, noting the cracked tiles and the way the light fell too dim on the countertop. And then she turned to me with that clinical smile that I recognized but didn't want to name. I had just finished telling her that I was thinking about getting a home aide a few days a week, someone who could help me with groceries and maybe drive me to appointments, since the bus had become too difficult with my hip. I expected support, maybe even relief, but instead she snapped back that she wouldn't be the one doing any of it, that she refused to become my caretaker. It wasn't even the words themselves, though they were sharp enough. It was the indifference behind them, the lack of hesitation, as if she had rehearsed this line, as if she had been waiting for the right opening to say it. I had thought of my daughter as my ally, my continuation, the person who knew my history because she had lived inside it with me. The person who had sat with me after her father's heart attack, who had once, as a teenager, brought me tea when I was too tired to rise from the couch. I thought those memories bound us. What I learned in that moment was that memories are not contracts, and gratitude is not inheritance. She saw me not as a mother to be honored in my frailty, but as a liability to be managed. The shock of that realization was not like fire, but like ice. It did not burn, it numbed, spreading slowly through me until even my breath felt foreign. I suppose this is where I must tell you who I am, though even that feels like a question now. I am a retired librarian, the kind of woman who lived by order and rhythm, who believed that books had answers and that family had permanence. I spent 40 years cataloging shelves, making lists, filing, and I brought that same devotion home. I folded her clothes, balanced her father's checkbook, made sure birthdays were remembered and holidays were marked with rituals. I was never careless. That is the word I want to underline. Never careless. And yet, somehow, my care has been rebranded as expectation, my loyalty as presumption. Now at 78, I make tea for one. I clean only the dishes I use. And at night, I walk slowly from room to room as if to remind the house that someone still occupies it. I don't want you to imagine me as bitter. Bitterness is a slow poison, and I am not poisoned. I am alert, maybe more awake than I have been in decades. But I want you to understand the violence of that sentence. Words can bruise more deeply than hands, and when they come from the person you once rocked to sleep, they carry the weight of betrayal multiplied. There was no anger in her tone, no heat. It was the cool efficiency of a woman stating a business fact. She will never take care of me. I cannot unknow that now. Perhaps you think I exaggerate, that daughters say many things they don't mean, that stress speaks through them. But let me tell you, there is a difference between the clumsy words of an argument and the deliberate chiseling away of responsibility. She said it because she wanted me to hear it, because she wanted to plant it like a flag, to make it clear that her horizon did not include me. And the cruelest part was not even the declaration itself, but the way she picked up her phone afterward, scrolling as if nothing of consequence had been said, as if the sentence had evaporated into the kitchen air. For her, it might have. For me, it lodged like glass. So I began to sit with that knowledge, alone in the evenings when the clock ticked louder than usual and the street outside emptied into silence. I looked at the framed photographs, the ones I had dusted for years. Her smiling with her children at the beach, her hand holding mine at her wedding, me in the background always. And I wondered what those smiles concealed. Was I always only a background figure, tolerated until inconvenient? Was I a prop, a sentimental ornament she could display to others until it became too heavy to carry? These are not questions you want to ask about your own child, but they arise uninvited when the silence grows thick. And that is where I stand now, not in bitterness, but in a clarity that is painful and liberating at once. I live alone in this house that carries the scent of lavender polish and old paper, with a cupboard that still holds jars of jam I made last summer, with a garden that produces more roses than I can prune. I live here with the echo of her voice. I'll never take care of you. It is not just a refusal, it is an unveiling. It showed me who she is now, and it forced me to remember who I am. I am not a burden to be calculated, not a ledger of future costs. I am a woman who has carried, endured, built, and yes, provided. And I still hold the pen that decides where my story and my legacy will go. The true catalyst came not in the words themselves, though they had already planted a wound that refused to close, but in the moment when I realized those words were not temporary, not careless, not something said in a flash of irritation. And soon. Forgotten. They were, in fact, the settled law of how she saw me, and that realization revealed itself in a detail so small that at first I nearly overlooked it. A week after she had told me she would never care for me, she came again to the house, not with a casserole dish or an apology, but with a leather-bound planner, the kind of professional book she always carried, filled with neat columns of numbers and dates and a list of responsibilities laid out in her compact handwriting. And as she set it down on the kitchen table, her fingers tapping against the cover as if sealing an agreement, she explained to me, without a flicker of embarrassment, that she had been in conversation with a real estate agent, that they had discussed the possibility of selling my house once I no longer required it, that she was thinking ahead to maximize the value of the asset. I sat there listening to her describe the square footage of my living room, the outdated appliances, the potential of my backyard if landscaped properly, and the words tangled in my chest, not because of the arrogance, but because of the certainty. She was not speculating. She was declaring, planning aloud for a future in which I was not present, and that was when the betrayal crystallized into something undeniable. I had paid for this house brick by brick, dollar by dollar, with overtime hours at the library, with nights I walked home in the rain because the bus had stopped running, with weekends I spent at the kitchen table balancing bills instead of resting, with the inheritance from my mother that I had sworn to preserve and build upon. I had polished these floors on my knees, planted the roses outside with my own hands, sewn the curtains when money was too tight to buy them, and yet, here was my daughter, speaking of it as if it were a piece of inventory, something she had already claimed, already shifted in her mind from mine to hers. She did not see me in this kitchen. She saw the absence of me. She saw the vacancy that would allow her to step in, profit, expand. And in that moment, though I kept my face still and my voice steady, something inside me tilted. I asked her calmly what she meant by discussing such things without me. She gave a laugh, light and dismissive, and said it was practical, that I should be grateful she was handling things, that it would save me the trouble later. The trouble later, meaning my death, or my incapacitation, the decay of my body, my inability to climb the stairs or stand at the stove. She spoke of it as if it were a business inconvenience, like a delayed shipment or a broken appliance, not the human fact of her own mother's mortality. I watched her lips move as she continued to outline which repairs would increase the resale value, how the market was favorable now, how she already had her eye on neighborhoods she preferred. And all I could think was that the girl I had raised, the child whose first steps I had cheered, whose school essays I had corrected, had transformed into a woman who could sit across from me and describe the disassembly of my life with the same tone she used to order groceries online. That was the moment when the pain shifted from shock to clarity, when the fog of disbelief burned away, and I saw, with painful precision, that I was not included in her vision of family. Family, to her, was an inheritance waiting to be claimed, a house waiting to be vacated, a set of obligations she had already disowned. I understood, sitting there, that if I waited passively, if I allowed her to shape the terms of our relationship, I would vanish long before my body did, reduced to a line on a property deed, an entry in her planner, a burden she had already cast aside. The catalyst was not her refusal to care for me. It was my awakening to the fact that she had already begun dismantling me, converting me into numbers and assets. I remember running my hand slowly over the table as she spoke, tracing the grain of the wood, remembering the times we had sat there together when she was young, spreading out construction paper and crayons, decorating Easter eggs, rolling dough for cookies that never came out even, but tasted like joy, helping her with algebra problems when she grew impatient. All of that history pulsed beneath my palm, and yet to her, this table was simply outdated oak, heavy and unfashionable, something to be discarded. She did not see the layers of memory. She did not see me. And I, in that instant, realized that if I did not act, if I did not claim myself, my story would end as a footnote in her calculations. When she left that afternoon, her planner tucked under her arm like a trophy, she kissed my cheek distractedly, already speaking into her phone as she walked out the door. I stood at the window and watched her drive away, the red of her car disappearing down the street, and I felt the stillness of the house wrap around me like a question. What will you do now? For the first time in many years, I had no automatic answer. I had always deferred, always given, always allowed her needs to come before my own, because that is what mothers do, or so I believed. But as the silence pressed against me, I understood that this silence could last forever if I let it, that my daughter would happily let me dissolve into it as long as the deeds and accounts were signed in her favor. So I sat down at that same table, opened the drawer where I keep my important papers, and pulled out my folder labeled Estate. I had not looked at it in years. Inside were the documents I had once prepared so carefully, the will naming her my sole heir, the insurance information, the account details. My handwriting was neat, my intentions clear, my devotion unambiguous. All of it presupposed a future in which my daughter would honor me, or at least remember me kindly. Now, looking at those pages, I felt not the satisfaction of order, but the sting of foolishness. I had placed everything in her hands, blind to the fact that she had already dropped me from hers. That evening, I did not cry. Tears would have been easier, familiar even. But what rose instead was a quiet determination, a voice I had not heard in decades, perhaps not since I was a girl leaving my parents' farm to make my way in the world. It said simply, "No, no, she will not define the end of your life. No, she will not profit from your erasure. No, you will not let yourself be reduced to the vacancy she is planning for." That no was the beginning of everything. The catalyst was not the wound itself, but the refusal to let it fester without response. The betrayal was complete, and it was clarifying. She had shown me her truth, and I would respond with mine. After that day, after the planner on my table and the words that stripped the last illusions from me, the quiet escalation began. Not through outright cruelty or open rejection, but through a slow dripping of gestures and tones, the kind of everyday. Dismissals that do not scream but gnaw, that eat away at dignity until one is left questioning whether the erosion is imagined or real. My daughter did not storm out of my life. She did not sever contact in a dramatic rupture. She simply shifted the way she spoke, the way she called, the way she made me feel like an object she had already moved to the corner of her vision, not worth looking at directly. This was the cruelty of neglect disguised as pragmatism, of distance disguised as busyness, and it was in many ways sharper than if she had cursed me outright. Our phone calls, once regular if not affectionate, became brief check-ins filled with sighs and distracted tapping on her keyboard. She would call me while on her way somewhere else, always between tasks, always making it clear that her life was packed with more important things, that I was one more item on her to-do list. "Do you need anything, Mom?" she would ask in a clipped tone, and when I hesitated, searching for words, she would already be filling the silence with excuses to hang up. "I've got a meeting, I'll call later," though later rarely came. When she did stop by, it was not with arms full of groceries or with an eagerness to sit down and share a cup of tea, but with folders under her arm, papers she wanted me to sign, documents she insisted I should get out of the way while you're still lucid. The words "while you're still lucid" landed like blows, not shouted but whispered. Subtle reminders that she saw me not as a woman still thinking, still deciding, but as a ticking clock running down toward incompetence. I began to notice how she looked at my house not as home, but as a space she was rehearsing to claim. When she walked into the living room, her eyes went not to the photographs, but to the furniture, assessing its condition. In the kitchen, she would open cupboards not to take out cups, but to comment on how outdated everything looked. In the garden, she would step carefully on the grass, as if measuring its potential for redesign. I stood there, watching my life become a real estate brochure in her eyes, and I felt myself shrinking. Each visit was less about me and more about the property, the inheritance, the eventual liquidation. She never said it outright, but her glances, her silences, her careful phrasing all suggested the same message. I was temporary, the house was permanent, and she was already rehearsing the transfer. What hurt most was the absence of small kindnesses that once came without asking. She used to bring me oranges in winter, remembering how my mother loved them. She used to linger over coffee, asking about the neighbors or about a book I was reading. Now, when she sat across from me, her phone always on the table face up, her fingers twitching toward it whenever it lit up. The distance between us grew wider than the length of the table. She smiled less, her eyes darted away when mine searched for them, and she spoke to me in the careful tone people use with the elderly when they are performing patience. I recognized that tone. It was the tone she used with her own children when they asked the same question 3 times. The tone of someone already exhausted, tolerating rather than listening. To hear that tone directed at me was to feel myself erased, converted from a mother into a nuisance. I told myself I was imagining it, that perhaps she was stressed, that perhaps she still cared but did not know how to show it. But then came the day when I overheard her speaking on the phone just outside my kitchen window, her voice sharp in the cold air, saying to someone I never knew who, "She's holding on, but it won't be forever, and when it's done, we'll be in a better position. I just need to get her through the next stage without too much drama." I stood in the kitchen, my hands wet from rinsing dishes, frozen not from the water, but from those words, from hearing myself referred to as a stage to get through, a barrier to be managed. She came in afterward, her face composed, chatting lightly about her children's soccer practice, never knowing that I had heard her, and I responded in kind, nodding, pretending, but inside something hardened. Something began to prepare. The escalation was not dramatic. It was incremental. She began to ask about my finances in a casual tone. "Are you keeping up with your bills, Mom? Do you want me to look over your accounts?" At first I thought it was concern, but the way she asked, the insistence that followed, revealed something else. When I told her I had it under control, she pressed, suggesting joint accounts, suggesting she could streamline my expenses, make things easier. Easier for whom, I wondered. Easier for her, when the time came to claim. I declined, politely but firmly, and the look she gave me then was not disappointment, but calculation, as if she had noted down my resistance for later. Even the grandchildren, sweet as they were when they did visit, became part of the unspoken play. They parroted lines they had heard at home. "Mom says your house is really old-fashioned," or "Mom says we'll probably move in here one day." They did not mean harm. They were children, repeating what they heard. But each innocent remark felt like a nail in the coffin of my place in this family. I smiled at them, offered them cookies, tried not to let the sting show. But inside, I could feel the tightening grip of being rewritten as someone who was already gone. At night, the house began to feel different. The silence was no longer simply the absence of sound. It was thick with anticipation, with the weight of a daughter's gaze that seemed to extend even when she was not here. I would sit in my chair by the window, the lamp casting its soft light, and I would think of how many times I had waited for her to come home as a teenager. How many nights I had left the light on so she would not enter darkness. And now here I was, the one waiting, the one sitting in the half-light, wondering when she would appear and what new erosion would follow. I began to notice my own body more, the way my hip ached when I climbed the stairs, the way my hands shook slightly when I tried to sew a button. These small weaknesses, which I had once accepted as part of age, now felt like evidence against me, ammunition she could use to justify her stance. Each stumble, each hesitation, each lapse became another proof that I was becoming the burden she had already declared me to be. And yet, even as I noticed these things, I also felt a stubborn core inside me strengthening, a refusal to be written out of my own story. The escalation, quiet as it was also a warning, and I was listening. It is strange how cruelty can arrive not in blows but in omissions, not in insults but in indifference. The absence of warmth, the withdrawal of attention, the subtle repositioning of me from subject to object, all of it compounded until I could no longer pretend it was temporary. My daughter was not merely busy, not merely stressed. She was building a world in which I did not exist except as an obstacle. The escalation was not hers alone, it was mine too. For with each new slight, each new omission, my resolve grew, my eyes cleared, and I began to prepare for the shift that would change everything. The shift did not come like a thunderclap, not as a sudden revelation or some external rescue, but as something quieter, more interior, a small but undeniable current running under the still surface of my days, and once I allowed myself to notice it, it grew until it could no longer be ignored. It began, I think, the morning I walked into the lawyer's office for the first time in many years, clutching the worn folder with my estate papers, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from the enormity of what I was about to do. The receptionist looked at me with the polite but distracted expression that young people often reserve for the elderly. Yet when she asked my name and I spoke it aloud, I felt an unexpected steadiness, as if the act of naming myself in that sterile office was the first declaration of a new kind of authority. I had spent so many years yielding, so many years letting others speak over me, plan for me, decide on my behalf, that even the simple act of saying my name clearly felt like an awakening. When I finally sat down with the lawyer, a woman with iron gray hair and the kind of gaze that does not flinch, I opened my folder and laid out my documents, the old will with its single heir named, the neat list of accounts and instructions. My voice was low at first, uncertain, as I explained that I wanted to make changes. But as I spoke, as I described the reasons, the certainty grew. I did not give her every detail. I did not spill the story of words that cut or glances that erased. But I said enough for her to understand that I wanted my daughter removed, that I wanted to redirect what I had built toward something or someone who saw me not as a burden, but as a human being still alive. She nodded, taking notes, her pen scratching across the page, and she did not question my choice, did not suggest hesitation, did not prod me with warnings about family conflict. Instead, she said simply, "It is your right." And that sentence landed inside me like a bell. It is your right. As she outlined the process, the signatures, the witnesses, the notarization, I listened with the alertness of someone relearning a forgotten language. Every word, every step felt like a reclaiming of ground I had given up without knowing. I chose carefully whom to name instead. My grandson, who had visited me one summer with no agenda but to mow the lawn and sit with me on the porch. A scholarship fund for girls who wanted to study literature. A local shelter for older women abandoned by their families. These choices were not made out of spite, not even out of anger, but out of a new clarity. I wanted what I left behind to nourish life, not entitlement. Signing those papers, my hand steady on the pen, was like placing a key into a lock and turning it toward freedom. I walked out of the office into the afternoon light, and for the first time in months, I felt air fill my lungs without weight. The street was busy, cars rushing past, people carrying bags, the world moving on. And yet inside me there was a stillness, a sense of ground under my feet. I walked slowly, deliberately, carrying nothing but my purse, and each step felt less like a shuffle of an old woman and more like a march of someone reclaiming her path. I did not tell my daughter what I had done. There was no announcement, no confrontation. The power was in the silence, in the knowledge that she no longer held claim over me, that her calculations had been undone without her awareness. The days that followed carried a subtle shift in how I moved through my house. The same rooms that had once felt like they were shrinking around me now opened slightly, as if the act of reclaiming my autonomy had unlocked them. I stood in the kitchen and brewed tea not as a woman waiting for someone to arrive, but as someone keeping her own company. I walked into the garden and pruned the roses not because I hoped she would one day admire them, but because I wanted to see them bloom for myself. Even the photographs on the walls changed in my eyes. I no longer looked at them as evidence of devotion that had gone unrewarded, but as reminders of who I had been, who I still was, and who I refused to let her erase. Of course, the shift was not only legal, it was emotional, spiritual, practical. I began to make small choices that reinforced the larger one. I stopped waiting by the phone, stopped measuring my days by whether she called or did not call. I began to take longer walks, even if they left me breathless, because I wanted to feel the pavement under my shoes, the sky above my head, the small proof that I was not immobile. Not yet. I went to the market by myself, choosing vegetables with care, speaking with the vendor about recipes, enjoying the small exchanges that reminded me I was still part of a world beyond the tight circle of disappointment. And one afternoon, on a whim, I bought myself a new coat, nothing extravagant, but warm and dignified, navy wool with deep pockets. Carrying it home, I felt like a girl again, bringing something precious into her life. Not because someone else gave it to her, but because she had chosen it for herself. It is difficult to describe how these small acts accumulate, how they layer into something larger. At first, they seemed trivial, but each one was like a thread being rewoven into fabric that had frayed. Each decision to act for myself, each refusal to wait, was a reminder that I still held the power of choice. Even the way I spoke to myself changed. Where once I might have muttered that I was old, too old to start over, I began instead to say that I was seasoned, that I had endured, that I had knowledge younger people could not fathom. Language matters, even in the solitude of one's own kitchen, and I began to choose words that built me up rather than diminished me. There was also the quiet recognition that I was not alone, though my daughter had tried to make me feel that way. I found comfort in conversations with neighbors, with the cashier at the store, with the woman who sat near me at church, each exchange small but genuine. I realized that family, the kind I had clung to as blood and lineage, could also be chosen, could be built from fragments of kindness and shared humanity. That recognition lifted me from the sense of being discarded, because I saw that I was still seen, still connected, even if not by the daughter I once thought would never let me fall. The shift then was not a single act, but a gathering of acts, each one weaving a net strong enough to hold me when the ground felt unsteady. I did not tell anyone, not even my grandson, what I had done with the will, but I carried the knowledge inside me like a secret talisman. I would touch the folder sometimes, still stored in its drawer, and feel the steady calm that came from knowing I had taken back what was mine. It did not matter if she suspected. It did not matter if she continued to measure my life in terms of her convenience. What mattered was that I had re-centered myself in my own story. Looking back, I see that this was the moment I crossed an invisible line from being defined by what was done to me to being defined by what I chose to do in response. I was no longer merely the woman left out of her daughter's plans. I was the woman who made her own. And that, though it may seem modest to an outsider, was the beginning of freedom. The peace I felt after altering my will did not last untouched, because peace is never something the past allows you to hold without challenge. And soon enough, the world I had sought to rebuild quietly for myself was intruded upon by the very forces I had been preparing to resist. It began subtly, with my daughter's sudden increase in phone calls, which might have appeared to any outsider as the attention of a dutiful child, but which I recognized immediately as something else, as the twitch of suspicion, as the beginning of her attempt to reclaim the ground she sensed I had taken back, where before her calls had been perfunctory, distracted. Now they came more frequently, and she filled them with questions not about my health or my days, but about paperwork, about documents, about whether I had thought more about planning responsibly. She used those words, planning responsibly, with the tone of a manager correcting an employee. And I understood at once that she was no longer assuming I would leave everything unquestioned. She was probing, testing, searching for signs of rebellion. At first, I answered her with calm neutrality, neither confirming nor denying anything, allowing her to believe that I remained passive. But each call left me drained, not because of the content itself, but because of the performance I had to maintain, the careful balance between revealing nothing and appearing cooperative enough to avoid direct confrontation. It was a strange inversion of roles, the mother pretending for the child's sake, except this time it was to protect myself rather than her. The strain grew heavier when she began to appear more often at my door, unannounced, carrying small gifts of fruit or soup, as if staging a pantomime of care. I wanted to believe, for a moment, that she was softening, that she regretted her harshness. But the way her eyes scanned the room, the way her questions always circled back to whether I had been thinking about the future, told me otherwise. She was watching me, waiting for an admission, eager to confirm her suspicion that I had undone her inheritance. The escalation became undeniable one afternoon, when she arrived with her children, bustling through the doorway with bags of takeout, announcing that they would have dinner with me. It should have been a joy, the laughter of my grandchildren filling the house, the warmth of family gathering at my table. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to savor the sound of their voices, the clatter of plates, the chatter about school and friends. But beneath that surface warmth, the true purpose of the visit revealed itself when she sent the children into the living room to watch television and sat across from me with her face arranged into seriousness. "Mom," she said, her fingers tapping the rim of her glass, "I've been thinking about your estate. I know it's not easy to talk about, but it's important we handle it properly. I don't want things to get messy later." I looked at her, at the neatness of her hair, the careful way she leaned forward as if confiding, and I felt the sting of recognition. This was not care. This was control disguised as duty. I asked her calmly what she meant by messy, and she replied with a rehearsed speech about taxes, about probate, about the difficulties families face when wills are not clear. She used the word clarity again and again, as if it were a charm, but what she meant was not clarity, but certainty for herself. I listened, my face still, and when she paused, I said softly, "I have already made everything clear." The flicker in her eyes was brief but telling. She understood then that something had shifted, that I had acted without her knowledge. And though she tried to mask it with a smile, the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. From that moment, her behavior changed. The mask of casual concern slipped, replaced by sharper questions, longer visits, conversations laced with warning. She began to remind me, pointedly, of how much she had done for me, driving me to appointments in the past, helping after my surgery years ago. Small favors she now presented as evidence of her entitlement. She framed it as fairness, as reciprocity, suggesting that it would only be just for me to ensure she was taken care of later. The irony was bitter. She, who had said she would never care for me, now demanded care in the form of inheritance. I listened, letting her words flow over me, and though anger burned in my chest, I did not show it. Instead, I allowed her to speak, to reveal herself more fully, because I knew that the confrontation was inevitable, and that my strength lay not in meeting her fury with mine, but in holding steady, in being the stone she could not move. The escalation pressed further when she brought her husband into it. He called me one evening, his voice carefully modulated, and spoke about financial planning in the abstract, as if he were giving a lecture. He said things like, "It's really important that assets stay within the family, and you wouldn't want outsiders to take advantage." Outsiders. That was how he framed anyone else I might choose to leave something to. Outsiders, interlopers, threats. I listened, thanked him for his advice, and hung up the phone with hands that shook not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of being spoken to as if I were a ward under their supervision. They had not said it outright yet, but I could feel the undercurrent. They would push, they would pressure, They might even seek legal means to pry open my decisions. They underestimated me, thinking my age equated to weakness. But they did not understand that clarity, once awakened, is harder than stone. The most painful moment came not from them, but from my grandson, the one I had chosen in my will, who came to me with hesitant eyes and said, "Grandma, Mom's upset. She says you're changing things, and it's going to hurt the family." His voice was not accusing. It was uncertain, pleading even, as if he wanted me to reassure him that everything was fine. I took his hands in mine, looked into his eyes, and said gently, "The family is not hurt by truth. The family is hurt by silence and by pretending. One day you will understand that love is not proven by money, but by presence." He nodded slowly, though I knew he could not fully grasp it yet, and I felt both sorrow and pride. Sorrow that he was being used as a pawn in their play. Pride that I had the chance to speak to him with honesty, to plant a seed that perhaps would grow later. By now, the air between my daughter and me was taut with unspoken battle. She came often, always watching, always hinting, and though I remained calm, inside I was weary, tired of being tested. And then came the day she dropped her pretense altogether. She stood in my kitchen, her voice low but edged with steel, and said, "Mom, if you've changed the will, you're making a mistake. You'll regret it. And it's not fair to me after everything I've done." For a moment, the child I had once held flickered before me. The girl who had cried when scraped her knee, who had leaned against me when her first boyfriend broke her heart. But that image was gone in an instant, replaced by the woman before me, hard, demanding, unable to see me as anything but a gatekeeper to her comfort. I did not shout. I did not argue. I only said, "I regret nothing." And the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. The escalation had reached its peak, not in violence, not in abandonment, but in confrontation that revealed the truth fully. She did not want me. She wanted what would remain of me, and I, finally, refused to give it. That refusal, quiet and steady, was the hardest act of my life, because it meant letting go of the hope that she might return to me, that the daughter I loved might reappear. But it also meant affirming myself, standing firm in the clarity I had fought to reclaim. The pressure tested me, but it did not break me. Instead, it carved me into something sharper, something unyielding. I knew then that the time for silence was ending, that I would have to make my stand not only in private decisions, but in words spoken aloud, in actions that could not be undone. The second escalation had not destroyed me. It had delivered me to the edge of the climax, where I would finally act not just to protect myself, but to assert my right to exist as more than an inheritance. The day of culmination arrived not with fanfare, but with the slow certainty of something long prepared, like the final stitch in a garment that had been mended over and over until at last the seam was sealed. I had carried the papers back from the lawyer's office. I had held them in the drawer of my desk. I had touched them sometimes with trembling fingers as if to reassure myself that they were real. But until the moment I signed them before witnesses, I had not yet crossed the point of no return. That morning, I dressed carefully, not in morning clothes, not in the faded sweater I often wore at home, but in a dress I had kept from years ago, navy with small white flowers, something dignified and firm. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not simply an old woman, but a woman preparing for a declaration. And for the first time in years, I held my own gaze without flinching. At the lawyer's office, the witnesses waited, two clerks with indifferent expressions, used to the endless parade of people finalizing their lives on paper. They could not have known what it meant for me, how each stroke of the pen was an act of reclamation, how every line of ink represented a refusal to be erased. I signed slowly, deliberately, my hand steady despite the weight of what I was doing. And as I finished, I felt a calm settle over me, not triumph, not gloating, but a profound stillness, as if a storm had passed and left behind a clear sky. When the lawyer gathered the documents, stamped and sealed, and said simply, "It is done," I felt the words settle deep into me. It is done. No one could undo it now. My daughter could plead, rage, scheme, but the truth was that I had taken the pen. I had written my own ending, and that ending would not belong to her. Walking home afterward, I carried nothing in my hands but the receipt. Yet I felt as if I bore a torch. The city moved around me in its indifferent rhythm, cars honking, strangers brushing past, a child crying for an ice cream cone. But inside me, there was a quiet, resonant sense of finality. I was not waiting anymore, not suspended in fear of her next question or her next demand. I had acted, and that action was irreversible. It is one thing to resist, to withhold, to refuse quietly. It is another to engrave your refusal into the law, to set it down in ink that no voice can erase. I had crossed into that realm, and there was no going back. When I returned to the house, I went to the drawer and pulled out the old will, the one that had once placed everything in her hands. I looked at it for a long time, my eyes tracing the neat letters of her name, the trust I had poured into those lines, the hope that she would honor me simply because I was her mother. That hope was gone now, burned away by her own words, by her indifference, by her cold calculations. I held the paper over the sink, struck a match, and watched as the flame curled its edges, devoured the lines, reduced her inheritance to ash. The smoke curled upward, gray and soft, and as it vanished into the air, I whispered aloud, not to her but to myself, "I release you, and I release myself." It was not anger, it was not vengeance, it was liberation. Afterward, I turned to the shelf where photographs stood. There was one of us taken decades ago at the beach, her small hand clutching mine, both of us smiling into the sun. For years I had displayed it as a testament to love, proof that once we had belonged wholly to each other. I lifted the frame, studied it one last time, and then removed the photo, placing it in an envelope I sealed and tucked into a box with other keepsakes. I left only one copy of that picture, small enough to keep in a drawer, not to deny the past, but to reduce its hold. On the shelf, in its place, I set a different photo. One of my mother, stern and gentle, standing in her garden. The woman who had once told me never to let anyone, not even blood, erase my worth. Looking at her face, I felt steadied, reminded that this act was not only mine, but part of a lineage of women who had fought, in their own ways, to be more than someone else's possession. That evening, when my daughter called again, her voice tight with suspicion, asking if I had done something foolish, I did not answer directly. I told her only that my affairs were in order, that everything was as it should be. The silence that followed on the line was sharp, filled with her awareness that she had lost control. She tried to press me, her words quickening, her tone turning sharp, but I remained calm, repeating only that it was handled, that she need not worry. In that moment, I realized that my strength was not only in the document signed, but in my refusal to yield, in the steadiness of my voice that no longer trembled. She could hear it, she could feel it, and it unsettled her. For once, she was the one without ground beneath her feet. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air cool, the stars faint above, and I let the silence stretch without fear. I thought of the years I had spent bending, yielding, waiting for affection to return, for recognition to come, and I understood that this act, this decision, had been the culmination not only of her betrayal, but of my own awakening. I had written myself back into the center of my life. No matter what she said, no matter how she spun her anger or her disappointment, the truth was that I had chosen, and that choice was binding. It was not about money, not about houses or accounts. It was about my dignity, my right to be the author of my own ending. The climax of my story was not loud, not violent. It was a quiet stroke of a pen, the soft crackle of paper burning, the steady sound of my own voice refusing to falter. It was in the knowledge that I had taken what she tried to strip away, my agency, my value, and returned it to myself. And in that calm, I felt a strength I had not known in years. This was the point beyond which there was no retreat, and I embraced it fully, not with bitterness, but with the serene certainty that I had finally, irrevocably, chosen myself. The house is quiet tonight, but it no longer feels like the silence of abandonment or the silence of waiting for someone who will not come. It is a different kind of silence, the kind that belongs to me, steady and whole. A silence in which I can hear the rhythm of my own breath and the creak of the floorboards as I walk from room to room, no longer searching for echoes of her voice, but listening instead to the presence of my own. I sit on the porch with a shawl around my shoulders and the air cool against my skin, and I think of the long path that has brought me here, from the shock of her words to the slow erosion of our bond, from the awakening in the lawyer's office to the steady flame that devoured her claim on my life. The journey was not one I would have chosen, not the ending I once dreamed of when I pictured growing old with family close by, but it is mine, and in its hardness there is also a strange kind of peace. I do not deceive myself into thinking she will forgive me, or that she will ever see my decision as anything but betrayal. I know she will tell her own story, in which she is the wronged daughter and I the ungrateful mother, and perhaps others will believe her, for the world is quick to pity the young and quick to dismiss the old. But that no longer matters to me, because I have learned that truth does not need an audience. It needs only the steadiness of one's own conviction. My truth is that I loved her, I raised her, I gave her the best of myself, and when the time came, she chose to cast me aside. My truth is that I will not reward indifference with inheritance, nor will I allow my final act to be written by the hand of someone who saw me as an obstacle. And my truth is that in choosing differently, I did not destroy myself. I reclaimed myself. There are nights when I still feel the ache of what could have been, when I picture a gentler ending, one in which she sat with me in the kitchen drinking tea, laughing at old stories, holding my hand when my steps grew unsteady. That vision will always live in me, not as a regret, but as a reminder of the love I was capable of, even if it was not returned. I allow myself those moments of softness because they do not weaken me. They make clear the depth of what I lost, And by knowing it fully, I know also the depth of what I have survived. Strength is not born in forgetting, but in remembering without being broken. Now, when I wake in the morning, I open the curtains and let the light in without wondering whether she will visit, whether she will call, whether I will be measured and found wanting. I walk into the garden and breathe the scent of roses, and I feel that they bloom for me alone, not as proof for anyone else. I make myself a simple breakfast. I sit with my books, and I speak aloud sometimes just to hear the sound of my own voice, because it is mine, steady and sure. This is my life, pared down perhaps, but no less dignified for its solitude. The absence of her presence no longer feels like a wound. It feels like space in which I can stand tall again. And when I think of the women who will come after me, the ones who may find themselves in kitchens like mine, hearing words from their children that slice through the heart, I want to say this: do not believe that your worth ends when someone else decides it does. Do not believe that blood obliges you to surrender your dignity. Do not believe that silence is the price you must pay for peace. We are allowed to choose, even at the end, especially at the end. We are allowed to take the pen and write the last lines of our lives with clarity, not fear. And if those lines diverge from what others expected, then let them. Our stories are ours. I do not know how many more seasons I will see, how many more mornings I will open the curtains to the light. But I know this: I will live them without apology, without begging for affection that does not come, without bending myself to fit the narrow expectations of a daughter who could not see me. I will live them in the company of my own soul, which has proven to me at last that it is enough. And when the time does come for me to leave this house, it will not be in shame or in silence, but with the calm assurance that I shaped my ending with my own hand, that I gave what I had to those who might carry it with love, and that I refuse to let betrayal have the final word. So tonight, as the stars gather faintly above and the air cools around me, I sit with a cup of tea and whisper into the stillness. Not for her, not for anyone else, but for myself and for the women who may hear me across time. We are not burdens. We are not obligations. We are not the shadows of our children's ambitions. We are lives, whole and complete, and we have the right, always, to choose ourselves.